Thanks everybody for coming, and thank you to the Archaeological Society of New Jersey for hosting this evening. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm a PhD candidate at Harvard University. And tonight I'm going to be talking about one site in my broader dissertation research project. And this site is a place where wampum was manufactured. And for those of you who don't know what wampum is, I'll explain that in a couple of slides. But before I do that, I just want to note that funding for this project has been in part through the National Science Foundation and the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research. And I want to quickly note too that Professor Chris Matthews of Montclair State has been a really valuable collaborator, and also someone who's let me use facilities there, the archaeological lab at MSU, so I really appreciate that. All right, so the site that I'm going to be talking about is actually located, hang on just one sec, there we go, is actually located on the ancestral territory of the Ramapo Lenape Nation. Many of the themes that I'm going to be talking about today resonate very much with some of the things that the Ramapo are going through today. I'm going to be talking about industrialization. I'm going to be talking about appropriation. I'm going to be talking a little bit about dispossession of land that happened in the colonial period and into the 18th and 19th century. And we're going to be talking about history. We're going to be talking about archaeology. But I just want to quickly note that these are things that the Ramapo today are also struggling with, but it's not something that's just in the past. For instance, a recent study came out that was able to evaluate the disproportionate negative health impacts that a Superfund site near Ramapo land has had, the effects that it has had on Ramapo people. So just to keep that in mind as we walk through some of the themes in the presentation. And a lot of these things have been informed by my conversations with the chief man of the Turtle Clan of the Ramapo Nation. So just wanted to acknowledge that before we really dive in. So to start, what is wampum? Well, that's a deceptively difficult question to answer. And anyone you ask will probably have a slightly different answer. If you ask an archaeologist, the simplest answer is, well, it is just a description of the object itself. And that is, wampum is a purple or white tubular, sort of, about a centimeter or so long, marine shell bead that's made from quahog shell. The purple beads are made from the lip of a clam shell. And the white beads were, in earlier periods, made from whelk, but also then in the 18th and 19th century, it was made out of conch shell. It was actually shipped up from the Caribbean. And so that's the archaeologist's safest answer, but wampum is a lot more than that, and it depends on who you're talking about, who's using it, what does it mean, and what's the context that you're referring to. So many of you might know wampum as an early American currency, and that was the case in the 17th century, where the bead was used in exchanges through the fur trade with nations of the Northeast and New England, and as well as the Great Lakes. And the Dutch became integral to their economy, and as a result, and due to also a shortage of coin, wampum became legal, like state-backed tender. And it was used informally by Europeans in that way as well. But we shouldn't reduce wampum to a currency, because it really was a lot more than that as well. And just to name a few dimensions that wampum has, for many indigenous communities, this is a sacred object, this is a social object, this is a political object, as well as an economic one. And so some of the I'm going to be focusing a little more on the economic dimensions for Europeans in the late 18th and 19th century, as who were producers of the bead at that time. But for indigenous people, it's important to note that like from thousands of years ago into the present, shell beads have been a really important part of indigenous culture and religion and politics and so on and so on. And you can't really reduce it to one of those. And its political dimensions, I think, are the most salient, at least today. For instance, what you see behind you in this image is a wampum belt that was actually commissioned by George Washington in the late 18th century to honor a treaty that was made at the time. And the Onondaga Nation today are using this belt as like a material claim, much like a treaty of any sort, that in order to try to urge the government to honor those treaties that were broken then in the 19th century. So it really has, it's really about politics and economics and the sacred, all of that all at once. But to talk about producers specifically, in the 17th century, producers for export of wampum were primarily nations around the Long Island Sound, southern New England. And the Dutch would trade with them and then exchange with Great Lakes nations, and all part of this kind of triangle trade of the early American economy. But by the mid-18th century, at least, we can see archaeologically examples of Europeans appropriating the production of wampum for their own profits. And this first happened, or the first earliest evidence of this is actually at Albany through Elizabeth Peña's work, who studied shell bead manufacture there as an almshouse as a mode of poor relief. And the other major region then into the later 18th and all the way through the 19th century was North Jersey, and specifically Bergen County. And if we zoom in even further to the Pascack Valley specifically, which is where by the mid-19th century, a site known as the Campbell Wampum Factory became a major exporter at a time when the fur trade had extended farther and farther west, even as far west as North Dakota, southern Oklahoma. And the shell bead manufacturing had really exploded to an industrial scale at the factory. And the factory also was excavated once before in 1924 by an archaeologist, Carl Schoendorf. And we'll talk a little bit about those collections because they're part of my broader dissertation in a bit. But to zoom into the Pascack Valley, here we have a map from 1861. And on this map, we can see a lot of different things. We can see, first of all, the Campbell factory itself. And here's also an image of one of their famous wampum drilling machines, which is now housed at the Pascack Historical Society. So shout out for anyone who's in the audience today who's from the Pascack Historical Society. They're the kind of stewards of the Campbell site and its history today. So around 1850, the famous Campbell brothers, so four brothers that came together and kind of ran this business and built this factory and built this machine. But before then, there was actually an earlier generation. And at that time, in the earlier 19th century, wampum production was really a widespread kind of household-based cottage industry. And the David Campbell House, which is what I'm going to talk about today, was located in the northern Pascack Valley. And David was actually the uncle of the four brothers who built the factory. So he's the kind of, again, the earlier generation. And the way that wampum production happened at this time was local merchants would actually be the ones to have shell at the store. And anyone in the surrounding region, both European descendant Americans, but also African descendant folks who were living in this region would go to the store, purchase shell, and then make the shell beads in their backyards or in their homes and the workshops, and then go back to the store and sell the finished beads, a little bit like a currency, but more typically like barter, which bartering like this sort of thing happened all the time with these sort of what are called putting out or outwork industries at the time. So one of the main questions that I want to bring to this, a fresh look at the Campbell factory, is to try to interrogate a little bit about the industrial narrative that's surrounding the site. So we have contemporary authors who visited the site, and then folks in the 20th century who wrote oral histories or collected oral histories and wrote those down in the early 20th century. And there emerges this story about the drilling machine, especially, for instance, that could drill in 1/3 of the time with infinitely less anxiety than the old people felt. And those old people at that time would have been someone like David Campbell, who would have used grinding wheel that's powered by foot and a bow drill that's done by hand instead of the drilling machine. And I also want to note too that even though I'm referring to the site as the David Campbell House, the histories mention that actually women were a major player in the bead making industry at that time, especially when it was a cottage industry. And so we shouldn't just think about David when we think about the David Campbell House, but rather his family in general, his wife, children even potentially. So we also have another source in the 20th century who notes that the drilling machine could drill 400 beads per day with, quote, an almost total elimination of waste. And it's for me that I find these quotes really fascinating because especially the words like waste and words like anxiety, I think are doing a lot of work in this industrial narrative. They frame these things as problems that then the factory and its drilling machines were a solution to. And I think there's definitely truth to that. There's no doubt about that. But I think also using archaeological data, we can kind of interrogate this using an independent line of evidence and say, well, what do you really mean by waste? And who really benefited from this, from the emergence of the factory? So now I'm going to shift over into the actual excavation of the site itself, the discovery and excavation of the site. So in 2019, I knew that the David Campbell House existed and that David Campbell was a relative, an uncle of the factory owners. But I didn't know that he was a wampum producer per se at that time. I did know, however, that the house that's pictured in this earlier slide here is still standing. At least the core of it is. It hasn't had major development, which is something rare in North Jersey generally. So I just, on a whim, left a message with the local landowner and talked about the project. And they called me back and said, well, you know, I think we found some shell in our backyard at some point, but I don't think it's the kind that you're looking for. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. So they were gracious enough to let me wander around, and I noticed as soon as I showed up, there's this Caribbean conch shell all over, particularly the garden areas of the site. And so for me, given that conch shell is not local to the North Jersey region, this was the kind of smoking gun for the site as a wampum workshop. So from there, again, at the sort of graciousness of the landowners, we conducted a phase 1 survey of the area. And here's an aerial photograph where you can see the red dots here are shovel test pits. And these squares here are where we did excavation units. And one of the things that we noticed at the site, and the purpose of the phase 1 was to just determine how much shell is there, where is it distributed, and is there enough that we could maybe sample to get a comparable comparison to the factory site that was already excavated. So here are the results of the phase 1 survey. And this, by the way, is all very fresh. We did a little bit of follow-up work a couple of weeks ago, I think almost a month ago. And so all the conclusions that I'm about to present are very much like very preliminary. But here's a map. So you see four maps here of the site, and the X's are where we dug shovel test pits, or small holes that tested for artifacts. And here you see shell by weight, and here you see shell by count. And then below are the like, artifacts that aren't shell. How are they distributed? And you can see that the shell seems to have a relatively discrete spatial distribution at the site. That is, it's not like spread out everywhere. It's in certain places, but not in other places. And that's a good sign, because that means we don't have to dig as many places. But at the same time, it's also kind of linearly distributed along what is a rock wall on the property today. And so this distribution seemed pretty interesting to me. Maybe there's, maybe there are two different locations where people are digging or where people are working. So these excavation units were placed in order to sample from different locations of shell bead production at the site. In the concentrated areas and in the less concentrated areas where there's a lot by weight and then where there's a lot by count. And figured out like, well, what are we really looking at here archaeologically? And as it turns out, in excavation unit number 2, which turned into also number 4, a 2x1, there are large cobbles that have been cut and placed into the subsoil with bits of shell that's like in the fill between them. At first we thought maybe this was an architectural feature, and I got onto the other side of it and also found sort of the same mirror image on either side, no evidence of a builder's trench per se. And so our current interpretation of this feature is probably something related to drainage, because there's a similar feature in unit number 3 here, which is almost due south and also running parallel next to the wall and also running parallel with all of the smaller bits of shell. So we imagine that potentially where around shovel test pit number 13 here is where the kind of core of the shell distribution is at the site. But it's also located probably next to what is a drainage ditch, stone line drainage ditch, maybe field stones that were put in. It's also running downhill slightly, so that also tracks. And the idea here is that some of the shell has actually been washed down into this drainage feature. At least that's our current interpretation. That could change once we actually look at the data a little more closely. So what else are we finding here at the site is the other question. What is the nature of the shell bead production space? Are we looking at a primary deposit, like people literally making beads in this location? Or are we looking at something like people making beads in the house and then sweeping them out the door? And given the fact that we're not finding just shell, we're also finding a lot of just household debris generally. I would probably suggest that this is something just sweepings from the household generally, or just a general kind of waste or midden type deposit. I said there's not a lot of bones, so it's a little bit of a strange assemblage. We got ceramics and glass and shell, and those are like pretty much it. But what's really convenient about that is the fact that we can then use ceramics to actually date when the shell was deposited roughly, and we can use the ceramics then to test this the period of occupation that we know David Campbell, based on property records, was living there from 1812 to 1844, and then you can see these mean ceramic dates that, of course, mean ceramic dating is always like a fuzzy science in many ways. But despite it being fuzzy science, it is really lining up directly with in all of the excavation units for the whole unit, lining up really well with what we know about the occupation of the site. So that gives us confidence to say that this hasn't really been disturbed. There isn't a lot of there's almost no evidence of occupation from the later 19th century in the places where we dug. And so the stuff that is there is really well preserved. So if we then go into looking at the shell, the archaeology of shell bead production, what can we learn about the kind of microeconomy of cottage industry at the time. So if we go back to this merchant store that I pointed to at near the beginning of the presentation, we can see actually David Campbell and what he did in, for instance, 1844 to acquire the shell and what he did with the final beads. On September 28th, he went to the Demarest store around the block, bought some dishes, which I think maybe these dishes, I like to think that those are the dishes that we just saw that were broken in the previous slide. He also bought 25 conch shells, spelled with a K, but it's pretty obvious what it's referring to, because in the next line, immediately we see he comes back a month later and sells thousands of wampum beads to the merchant. So this is, I think, a really special site to be able to tie these transactions, their prices, and the temporality of how long it takes to make the bead and then come back to the store and whatnot, but also in terms of the quantity of the average trip to the store. And that quantity of average, like how many conch shells did David buy when he went to the store, is also roughly what's reflected in the sample that we got from the site, conveniently. It's a little hard to make sense of all of this, but long and short, in the column here, MNI, means the minimum number of individual specimens. That is, like how many species, how many individual conch shells are represented in the sample. It's roughly about 20. I mean, as a minimum, of course, and like that's comparable to what David Campbell did when he bought shells in September 28th. So it's pretty. For me, I like to think about this quantity of stuff as a kind of, oh, this is like a month. This represents a kind of like a month of work and like one big trip to the store. And in this assemblage, what's interesting to note is that we only found one drilled object. That could mean a lot of different things. Maybe we're not digging in the right place, right? Maybe drilling was happening somewhere else, or the waste from drilling was being dumped somewhere else. But given the rest of the survey at the site, I'm pretty confident at least we have what we're going to find, and if there is anything else, it might be difficult to find. And so we kind of are, I'm assuming at the moment that we have a representative sample of some kind. But I was surprised by that, because that's a very different story than what I've seen at the Campbell factory. So if we return to comparing the workshop to the factory, and in the process also try to interrogate the effects of industrialization, this notion of waste, this feeling of anxiety and the stress of making sure you don't break a bead when you're drilling it. I think by comparing these two sites and looking at the archaeological assemblage, we can actually see quite a dramatic difference in what archaeologists term wasters versus debitage. For those who aren't familiar, debitage is objects that are broken from something. It's usually used to refer to like stone tool making. But in the context of shell, you take a conch shell, you break off pieces of it, and then you let it go. And that represents a kind of routine breakage that you do for every type of bead. The same ratio would be for that as it would be for the next bead and the next bead. You have the same amount of debitage per bead. And wasters are what we call beads, basically, that were broken in the process of drilling. So if we look at wasters at the David Campbell House, we have one, maybe two total for over 2,000 objects that were sampled at the site, which is a very small kind of waster to debitage ratio. And I was surprised at that, because at the factory, at least by count, from the museum collections, which are problematic in their own way, but we're looking at least, by count, almost half of the assemblage is broken beads that are clearly also broken in the process of drilling. And by weight, that amounts to just like still 30%, it's still a lot. And of course, that could be due to issues of like convenience, issues of, well, well, maybe the archaeologists who dug the factory didn't do a very good job and didn't sample all of the stuff that like would have been like debitage that we would look at today. But I think this leaves open the question of whether the drilling machine really did eliminate all waste, at least in the way that the 20th century oral histories describe it. And if that's the case, I think we need to think about industrialization as something that, as concentrated capital, certainly benefited the Campbell family in different ways. But for all of the other households that were making beads at the time, I think that their anxiety might have emerged as much from the fact that there's a factory down the street as the fact that it's using a drilling machine. So the other thing about this, when we think about the effect of industrialization as it mingles with shell bead production, if you look on this photo in the right-hand corner, you can see that this is an illustration from 1886, where someone who visited the site at that time, and you can see that this belt is powering 4 grinding wheels simultaneously. No longer, you don't need to use your feet anymore. And you can also see that there's a figure standing behind the kind of protagonist of the image, the Campbell owner. And the text that goes along with this image notes that there was at least one black worker in the factory. So I tend to like interpret this as someone probably of African descent who's working in the factory for a wage. And when we think about it like that, we also need to note that the fact that there are 4 grinding wheels that are working at the same time would probably have really negative health impacts, relative at least to a small household producer. So when you have 4 grinding wheels all going at the same time, you can actually, I've actually been able to calculate the amount of calcium carbonate, which is basically shell dust, the amount of calcium carbonate particulates that are released into the air as you grind down a bead. And given the size of the factory, my calculations are at least that this would have been at least, today is 400 times over the OSHA limit for calcium carbonate particulates in the air, which would have put workers in the factory at significant risk of silicosis, which is a lung disease that's common in other kinds of intensive industries like this. So, of course, at the time, you know, knowledge about health and knowledge about worker safety limitations would not have been like in the minds of the workers per se, but it is a kind of inevitable byproduct of a concentrated and intensified industry that would have been slightly mitigated by having a bunch of different producers all working in their own homes at a smaller scale. So hopefully that complicates at least some of the industrial narrative that's surrounding the site. And I want to just make a final note here that a lot of folks, when they hear about this project, that they assume that I'm studying a kind of counterfeit object, kind of counterfeit money, or a kind of fake wampum, right? Because it's made in the factory instead of by Native Americans. But at the same time, I think these beads are ending up being incorporated into indigenous projects of sovereignty, as in the case of wampum belt, diplomacy, and they do really have a power, despite the fact that they might have been made by Euro-Americans or even African-descended Americans. And so all of these dimensions of the sacred and the social and the political and the economic that I talked about at the beginning for indigenous communities, I think we can also think about those for the producers in Park Ridge at the same time. What effect did the factory have on social relations at the time? Were neighbors suddenly resentful of the fact that there is a factory that shows up that sort of starts to monopolize the production? And what effect did that have on both political and the economic and the social and the sacred dimensions of living in the Pascack Valley at the time for producers. And I think that's one of the things that wampum is really special about, because it can cross all of these different domains and really make you think twice about, well, what do we really mean by, what do we really mean by money, or what do we really mean by a treaty, and what kinds of relationships we want to have today in the present. So hopefully some of the themes in this talk have stimulated that for you, as well as being a nice overview of one of the sites in my dissertation project. So thank you so much for listening and watching. And there are a few folks that I want to thank. Of course, the funding bodies that I mentioned at the beginning, and also Chief Man of the Ramapo Lenape Nation, as well as many Pascack Valley residents who have literally taken me into their homes, including Belle and Michael, Butch and Michelle, and Keith and Shagna. And of course, all of the folks at the Pascack Historical Society. I really appreciate everything you've done for me along the way.